Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a really interesting economic puzzle called dualism. It's a concept that gets right to the heart of why, in so many countries, the economy seems to be split into two completely different worlds. I mean, have you ever looked at a country and just wondered how it can have these glittering, super modern cities and at the same time, these really traditional rural villages? It's like you've got one nation, but two separate worlds are running side by side, you know? And there's this huge gap between them. So the big question is, how is that even possible? Well, one of the first people to really try and answer this was a Dutch economist, J.H. Book. So let's dive right into his theory, which he called social dualism. And what's interesting is he developed this whole idea while he was studying the economy of colonial Indonesia. So Boke's big idea was this. These two worlds exist because you've got an imported, high capitalist system, think modern Western businesses, crashing head-on with the country's own traditional, pre-capitalist social system. We're talking about two completely different ways of life, trying to exist in the same place, and, well, they just don't mix. What he noticed was that in the traditional system, which he called the Eastern system, people's needs were pretty limited. They basically worked just enough to get by, and this leads to a really counterintuitive economic idea. Think about it like this. If the price of coconuts suddenly shot up, you'd think a farmer would sell more, right? But Bokeh said no, they might actually sell fewer coconuts. Why? Because they could make the money they needed for the week way faster and then just take the rest of the day off. It's a classic concept called a backward-sloping supply curve of labor. And all of this led Bokeh to a really powerful conclusion. You just can't take standard Western economic theories and expect them to work in these economies. It's just not going to happen. He had this great quote where he said, it's like trying to transplant the delicate hothouse plants of Western theory to tropical soil. They're just not built for it, and they're going to fail. But as you can imagine, not everyone agreed with Bokeh. His theory got some major pushback, especially from a guy named Professor Benjamin Higgins. Higgins was like, hold on a second. He argued that people's wants aren't limited at all. They want things like radios and bicycles. And he also pointed out that labor isn't always unorganized. You've got strong trade unions. Plus, people are clearly moving around, migrating from villages to cities looking for work. So the picture was a bit more complicated. So this critique led Higgins to come up with a totally different angle. He said the real problem here isn't social or cultural, it's technological. And that brings us to his theory of technological dualism. Okay, so Higgins basically saw the economy split into two camps. On one side, you have the modern industrial sector. This is capital intensive. That's just a fancy way of saying it runs on expensive machinery. And because of that, it only creates a limited number of jobs. Then on the other side, you've got the rural sector. This is labor intensive. It's all about human work, like farming. And this is where it gets really interesting, especially when you look at the industrial sector's problem. The key word here is fixed technology. Just think about it. A big factory machine needs, say, 5 people to run it. No more, no less. So even if you have a ton of extra workers show up looking for a job, you can't just hire them. Without buying another expensive machine, more capital, you simply can't create more jobs. All those extra people, they're just left without work. So what happens to all these extra workers? Well, they flow back into the rural sector. See, here the technology's flexible. You can always find something for another person to do on a farm. But, and this is a big but, eventually you hit a wall. You get to a point where adding more people doesn't actually produce any more food. The same amount of work is just being split among more and more people. It looks like everyone is busy, but they're not really adding any value. And that's a phenomenon we call disguised unemployment. Okay, so we've looked at a social divide and a technological divide. But there's a third, absolutely crucial piece to this puzzle: money. This is where Professor Hagala Mint comes in with his idea of financial dualism. He pointed out that there's a deep split in the financial system itself. Mint basically said, look, you've got two completely separate money markets operating at the same time. First, there's the organized market. These are your big commercial banks, your formal institutions. They give loans to large modern businesses, and the interest rates are pretty low. But then, you have the unorganized market. We're talking about village money lenders, for instance, and they're lending to small farmers and producers, but, and this is key, at incredibly high interest rates. And here's the real kicker. Government policies can actually make this whole problem even worse. So let's say a government has a cheap money policy to keep official interest rates low. Sounds good, right? Well, what happens is that the bulk of that cheap money flows straight to the big industrial sector. The traditional rural sector gets starved of that capital. So where do they go for loans? Back to the unorganized market, where they're forced to borrow at those super high rates. And that just makes the gap between the two worlds even wider. Now, you might be thinking, okay, these are some old theories. And you're right, they've been around for decades. But, and this is so important, social, technological, and financial dualism are still incredibly relevant for understanding the challenges that so many economies are facing right now, today. So what's the big takeaway here? Well, what these theories do so brilliantly is show us the deep, structural reasons why inequality is so persistent. They explain why you can have booming growth in one part of the country, but it doesn't automatically trickle down to help everyone. They really shine a light on the root causes of huge problems like unemployment and inequality, showing us that these aren't simple fixes. These problems are woven right into the fabric of the economy. So we've spent this time exploring the why, the social, the technological, and the financial forces that create this massive divide and keep it going. But that leaves us with the biggest, most important question of all, doesn't it? How do we actually bridge this gap? How do you take these two separate worlds and bring them together into one single healthy economy? Now that is the real dilemma. Thank you for joining.